Hey guys, Tom here from the Investing with Tom YouTube channel. Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoyed today's video, hit like, hit subscribe, and that way you can see future videos as well. So before we get into the topic of today's video, we do have a sponsor, quite a fitting one at that, given what we're talking about in this particular video, and that sponsor is Hatch. Now, Hatch are a New Zealand-based company, and they have been my personal broker of choice for investing in the States. As a New Zealander, I've been using them for over a year now. Very, very easy platform to use and much cheaper than many of the banks and the traditional alternatives. So when I made my first ever US investment, I spent $90 US on making that trade. I could have done the same trade in Hatch now for $3 US. So substantially, ridiculously cheaper than the bank. So they've been my broker of choice for over a year now. Absolutely love the platform, and they're constantly making improvements to it as well. And one of the recent improvements that they've made, which is of particular interest to myself, is an integration with Sharesight. So, and as many of you may know, I use Sharesight to track my investment performance and also make tax time a whole lot easier. And you can now have your purchases and your sales transfer straight from Hatch into Sharesight to make that even easier again. So we do have an offer from Hatch. All you will need to do is click the link that I'll put up on the screen here and also link down in the description, which is hatch.as/investingwithtom. Basically, if you start a Hatch account through that link and deposit 100 New Zealand dollars into your account, you'll also get an additional $20 deposited to give you a bit of a kickstart to kick off your US investment. So feel free to check that one out, and I hope you enjoy the platform as much as I do. Okay, so as the title suggests, the topic of today's video is all about why I mainly invest outside of New Zealand and in the United States specifically. If you look at my portfolio, well over half of it is actually in the US, which is a little bit strange for an investor based in New Zealand. And it's actually one of the more common questions I get from people first getting started in the stock market who are also based in New Zealand. You know, why do I talk so much about US companies? Why don't you talk more about New Zealand companies or Australian companies? What are sort of the reasons why most of my money ends up being invested overseas? So that's what I want to talk about today. If you want the very short summary answer, it's basically I find more opportunities in the US than I do in New Zealand and Australia. But I'd like to get into some more detail about what that exactly means. Now, before we get into the specifics here, I think it is important to understand my personal investing strategy. Many of you will know this, but we do have a lot of new subscribers to the channel, so I thought I'd give another bit of an update on kind of how I approach things here. And basically my investment philosophy is pretty simple. It can be broken down essentially to trying to buy high quality businesses at attractive prices. I'm looking for businesses generally that can grow substantially over the long term, but I don't want to pay such a ridiculously high price up front that it turns a really good business into a really bad investment. So that's sort of my investment philosophy. I definitely pay a lot of attention to valuation, but I am also very concerned and very interested in how a business can grow over time, expand its profitability, expand its cash flows, and just become a really good business and an investment for me when I'm putting my hard-earned money to work. So that's sort of my investment philosophy. And as I've gotten more into investing over the last few years, a lot of my money has tended to flow to US companies, and there's a couple of fundamental reasons for that. So in the entire world, there are something like 50,000 public companies. There are an absolutely enormous number of public companies around the planet, and probably about 4,000 or 5,000 of those companies are in the US. And compare that to New Zealand, we only have about 150, 160-ish kind of public companies here in New Zealand. So the overall pool of potential investments is much, much larger outside of New Zealand than it is within New Zealand. And that's one of the main reasons why I tend to invest over in the States. There's simply more companies to look at. As an investor, when I'm trying to look at quite specific criteria for a business, so something with long-term growth, good management, some sort of advantage in the marketplace that allows them to prosper much more than their competitors. That pool of 160 businesses here in New Zealand tends to shrink down pretty quickly. And then when I get into the next level of going through that process and trying to figure out, okay, out of these businesses that I understand and I really like and I think have good prospects, which ones of them can I buy at substantially less than what I believe intrinsic value to be, to turn this into a really good investment as well as, just a good business. So that whole process kind of leads me into a very small pool of New Zealand companies, often zero New Zealand companies to be quite honest, that meet all my personal criteria, and it means that I end up over in the US. So that's one of the main reasons. I really just find more opportunities in the US. In my everyday life, I interact with a lot of United States companies, so I often film the audio for these videos on my iPhone. That's what my microphone's linked up to, so I'm using Apple products. If I drive down one of the main streets in Hamilton where I live, you'll see a bunch of fast food restaurants, and not very many of them are from New Zealand, I can tell you that for free. So just the very nature of businesses that I'm exposed to in my everyday life, they also happen to be from the US, so I have a really good understanding of how these businesses make money, what the customer experience is like, and again, that fits really nicely when we're looking to get in under the covers and kind of understand the inner workings of a business and make an investment from there. So that's the first thing that's really led me to investing a lot overseas. Is simply the opportunity set is larger and I just find more things overseas. The second thing that has really pulled me over there is actually just following my favorite investors. One of the ways that I like to find potential investment ideas or lists of companies that I can research a bit more deeply is by looking at something called a 13F filing. And as many of you will know, a 13F filing basically allows the everyday investor to see what our favorite, big time investors in the US are buying and selling. So we can literally go in and see, what does Warren Buffett own, what does Guy Spear own, what does Monish Prabrai own, what does Lee Lu own, what does Charlie Munger own. We can see the portfolios of all these really, really top investors. And I follow a lot of US investors. They're the ones that I have very similar philosophies to in terms of the way that I like to think about the world. And to be quite honest, I probably couldn't even tell you the names of more than like 2 New Zealand investors. We just don't have that community over here to the same extent as in the US. And when I'm looking through all these 13Fs, they are obviously all US companies. So if I do some digging into a company that a favorite investor of mine is also invested in and come to a decision on making an investment in that company, that again pulls me over to the US. Now, I think it's certainly worth mentioning that there are some major benefits to having money invested here in New Zealand versus Australia or the US or outside countries. And really those benefits are mainly around taxation. So with our New Zealand companies, we get treated really, really well with things like dividends. So if a company pays us a dividend, we pay tax on that up front, but we can actually claim a lot of that tax back through something called an imputation credit. And our Australian investor friends have something very similar called the franking credit system. And that's something that's not available in the US. So when we pay tax on our US dividends, we do pay higher tax rates typically than here in New Zealand. I'm certainly no tax expert, but that's definitely been my experience. So there are upsides to having a portfolio more New Zealand based. So that's the first thing. One of the other things that we also have to consider is exchange rates. So obviously when we're making investments overseas, we are taking our New Zealand dollars and we're converting that into US dollars and Australian dollars. In my case, at least, those are kind of the 2 other countries that I tend to put my money to work in. And that is a potential risk or a potential benefit depending on what way you want to look at it. Regardless, you are going to have another variable that will mean your portfolio will fluctuate up and down, potentially a little bit more than if it was just purely a New Zealand-based portfolio. So if the US dollar gets stronger or weaker, that means that my portfolio value over in the States will go up or down as a result of that, even if the US dollar share price does not change. So that's something worth considering. Personally, I am a pretty regular contributor to my sort of US dollar account, so over time I sort of average out to a pretty average US dollar exchange rate, but if I do see some extremes, I certainly no foreign exchange trader or anything like that, but I've made a video on the topic, and I do tend to take advantage of some wild swings if there are any in my favor, and I can buy US dollars more cheaply than I can typically. So that frankly is about the extent of it, and that's the reason why a lot of my portfolio ends up overseas. If I had 50 different investment opportunities that looked equally attractive, you'd probably see 7 or 8 of them in New Zealand, to be quite honest, just because the tax treatment is better. Tax time actually is easier as well when I go to do my returns and that sort of thing. But unfortunately, that's not how the investing world works. We don't have massive numbers of equally attractive opportunities if you're quite a harsh grader, as Modus Provider might put it, with your assessment of different companies. For me personally, I'm looking for sort of really 1 or 2 investment opportunities per year, and if I can execute on that over a long period of time, that works out to quite a substantial number of companies over an investment lifetime. And frankly, the 1 to 2 companies in recent years have just been US based. If they were New Zealand based, you'd see much more of my portfolio in New Zealand. If they're Australian based, you'd see much more of my portfolio in Australia. So I hope that answers your question on the topic. As I say, I do get this one fairly frequently around why I talk about US companies all the time. Frankly, it's just because what I'm reading and companies I'm looking at, the majority of the time they just tend to be based in the US. I don't have any, I don't think there's anything special about putting money into the States versus putting money into New Zealand. I'm sorry, US viewers, but I don't think that's the case. If I find equally attractive opportunities anywhere basically around the world, I will take advantage of that. That's just the way that it's played out over these last few years, is most of those companies have been in the US. So that's why I invest mainly in the States, and that is all for today's video. If you did enjoy it, please hit like, hit subscribe. Feel free to take up that Hatch offer so you can get a free $20 in your Hatch account when you sign up. Again, I'll leave the link up on the screen to that one if you're interested. Outside of that, you can watch some older videos over there, hit subscribe over there, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.